Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric, and we're continuing the series Sega Race Renaissance, where I review every single 3D arcade release Sega game ever made in a retrospective fashion. And today we have Scud Race Plus, and also known as Sega Super GT in North America, and I'll explain the naming differences in a few moments. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But let's jump right into Scud Race Plus. This is just Scud Race with some extra features, and I did talk about this game about a year and a half ago on the channel, but we get to do it again because it's a retrospective and I have to include it. Also because the game is absolutely spectacular. The developers thought they were going to be making a direct sequel to Daytona, but they ended up making this instead before they got to Daytona 2, and this is the first game released on the Sega Model 3 hardware. And when this hardware was in arcades, it blew absolutely everything out of the water. It wasn't even close for the second place hardware. This hardware was just obscene when it came out, and it still looks great today. Outside of spinning my car out, that was a mistake. And I am playing this on the Supermodel 3 emulator, which is a spectacular emulator for all the Model 3 games. If you've never tried it, you definitely should check this out because there is no home release of Scud Race even to this day. The only way you can play it is if you find an arcade cabinet in an arcade, or if you emulate it like I am doing here. And I am on the lookout for original Scud Race 3 hardware because I would like to add this to my original PCB collection. But this was also made by Sega AM2, and if you don't know that name, they are one of the biggest developers for Sega, and they release basically every Sega arcade game that always shows up on top 10 lists of best Sega games of all time for arcades. They basically could do no wrong in the 90s and the early 2000s, and Scud Race is evidence of that. But it is a lot of fun to play it in Supermodel because you can force this game into true widescreen 16:9 support, and it's just better and more of a good thing. And when you go into that cockpit view, everything looks spectacular. But I will tell you, even on easy, the timer on this game is very cruel. You make a mistake, you're not going to finish the race. It demands perfection of you, and the handling is such that it takes a long time to learn each individual car. I'm using the beginner car here, the Porsche 911 GT, and that's the one I recommend you start with if you've never played the game, because some of the more advanced cars take hours upon hours of practice just to make sure you're not going to throw it into the wall. And even saying that, because I haven't played in a few months, it's still a difficult game, but it makes you want to learn it. It makes you want to understand it. It makes you want to see how to get better. Now, interestingly, this never got a port, but it was supposed to come to the Dreamcast, and I will talk about that in about a minute and a half, because the tech demo was shown to developers when the Dreamcast hardware was still being developed. It wasn't finalized yet. But oh, when you go underneath that little bridge there in first-person view, this game screams. The sense of speed is probably the fastest of any Sega arcade racing game they have ever made, including stuff like Daytona 2, which also has a very similar sense of speed, but this just does it for you. And if you hit the wall, somehow you magically bounce and flip the car perfectly to hit the pit, so you can see what the pit crew looks like when they're doing their job and fixing that bumper. Generally, I never go into the pit. You can't do that much damage to your car that it's necessary, but I accidentally hit the wall, and you get to see it right here, and it is a lot of fun just to check that little bit of a bonus out. But again, just the sense of speed that this game gives you is spectacular. It probably hasn't been ported home since the Dreamcast because it is involving a license from a racing group, and a lot of times the developers lose the license to games and they can't actually bring them out again without rebuying it, and more often than not it's probably more expensive than they'd like to pay. But you'll see you get a decent amount of tracks in Scud Race Plus and the ability to mirror them as well, which is going to give the game a little bit more longevity. But honestly, it's an arcade game, so you're meant to play it for minutes, not for hours. But the soundtrack and the engine noise sound effects are spectacular, so go ahead and listen to Scud Race for like 45 seconds and I'll come back and talk about the lost Dreamcast version. Enjoy!
3, 2, 1, go!
Your engine temperature is rising.
Extension.
Just a perfect soundtrack that totally drives home that action. But what you're looking at now is a quote-unquote Dreamcast demo of Scud Race. It's not running on a Dreamcast, it's running in a Dreamcast emulator, and it is running on a specification that wouldn't have been final Dreamcast hardware. This was still when Sega was developing the board and chipset, and it wasn't at full power. But it does go to show that Scud Race was coming to Dreamcast, so the tech demos were shown off, and it was canceled. That's probably one of the biggest cancellations in Sega history, because fans really wanted this. And thankfully a dude named Laurent, who owns and preserves and releases different Dreamcast demos and prototypes, released it so we can do something like this. And if you put it side by side, of course there's no racing going on, but you can see on an early Dreamcast spec, something that looks more like Sega Saturn x3, what Scud Race would have looked like on Dreamcast hardware. And it is ultimately so unfortunate that we didn't get this game at home, because people were really looking forward to this. It was previewed in the Dreamcast development articles in different magazines, and this was on Sega's release calendar, and then they just took the whole damn thing away from us. And if there's one company that is famous for not porting home games from the arcades that fans really want, it is Sega. They take first, second, and third place in not porting home these incredible games. And like I said, if you want to play Scud Race right now, you got two options. Find an arcade that's got a cabinet with it on the floor, or use Supermodel 3 to emulate it. It's not on Xbox Live, it's not on Steam, it's not on anything, and it's still, at the time of me recording this, is true. Now I hope I'm wrong by the time this come out and Sega finally ports it home, because some of the people at Sega that work there now have said that they're going to start re-releasing some of their old IPs or intellectual properties, and I really hope what they're talking about is just Scud Race, because this would be incredible on any modern console. Hell, you could just talk to the Supermodel people, work with them, get this emulator running a little bit tiny better on hardware consoles today, and people would buy it in droves. Make it a $10 game, and I think Sega would make their money back all day long. But it's just one of those games that is iconic for arcade games. This is just an iconic arcade racing game. It's not just an iconic Sega game. It is an iconic arcade game. This is arcade history in the making when they released this game. And they did sneak in a few things, because Sega always loves letting you play as animals. So hold the start button, pick the Dodge Viper on the super easy track, and suddenly we are driving an automatic, but you could pick a manual house cat. That's right, folks, you can play as a cat in Scud Race Plus. It is the best cat racing game ever made. But there's different secret cars on this track. You can play as a tank, you can play as a school bus with the photos of the AM2 developers that made the game, and you can play as a toy car that has a rocket. This is just a fun little addition, but it kind of feels like Daytona, because it's just an oval. It just happens to have some bowling involved in it as well. Let me tell you, this cat is not very easy to control. He darts, or she darts, not quite sure which it is, back and forth so rapidly. It's kind of like an actual cat. They just pinball around the house, bumping into pretty much everything, and I say that as having had a cat before. But honestly, it's just a fun extra touch. It makes you smile, it makes you laugh. Scud Race Plus was just a ROM update to the original arcade board. It allowed you to have those mirror modes, it allowed you to have an extra track, and it allowed you to race as a cat, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, Sega actually has a long history of letting you play as animals in their arcade racing games, and I'm sure this won't be the first time I talk about that. But let's get a strike right here. It's so hard to do with the cat, but I was able to make it work, and if you do it, a giant rat comes out and makes a squeaking noise. And they coded that in, folks. But yes, Scud Race and Scud Race Plus are spectacular games. Honestly, there's no real reason to play Scud Race over Plus, because Plus has everything the original game does, plus extra. So if you're going to emulate one of these, or if you want to go out and find original hardware for one, definitely make it Scud Race Plus. It's the better version to get. But this is just a legendary arcade racing game, and this is Sega at their best. Model 3 hardware was obscenely impressive, the developers were obscenely talented, and the games they made were obscenely incredibly good. So if you for some reason never played Scud Race, let this video convince you to do it, and leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think after you play it. Or just leave me a comment and tell me I'm right, Scud Race is the best of all time. We'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.